We've dealt with the subject of suretyship quite a bit, in essence, through most of our discussions. One way or another, the subject comes up. When we're dealing with Jesus Christ, we would know and understand through Scripture that He was made surety of a better testament or a better covenant. And therefore, our system of society as an aggregate of participation, especially through the social insurance registration system, is really more based on an old covenant idea that we would stand or be in a surety position for our situation in society. Therefore, we'd actually be our own guarantor. More than not, of course, there are flaws within a system like that because, of course, you have to enforce against such things. And therefore, the misunderstanding when people go down the role of secular society, they may not understand what they've actually entered into. And our concern with this, can be only understood by research. And we invite people to do as much as they can. I had run across an interesting book a number of years ago. It's called Corporate Suretyship. The actual writer's name is Christ, which I think may be somewhat of a idea of a ghost name to reflect how powerful the actual idea of suretyship is, because we know biblically it would be Jesus Christ as our surety. And so therefore maybe the writer here had the fancy to use something in a ghost name that would actually give you that clarity. The book that we're going to read out of was also an insurance series book. So uniquely throughout this book, you will see inferences to Scripture being talked about, but there's a couple pages I'm going to read today that will give you an understanding of suretyship and what actually some secular writers have thought to put into a few thoughts to get you started. So we're going to start just in the introduction at the beginning, which is the development of suretyship. And I'm not agreeing with every statement or how it's flavored, but I want you to understand that these are the people that actually structure and run society that actually have this as teaching aids. And because people have generally not read too much on this subject and kind of just dive right into being a surety, they unfortunately have gone through a lack of understanding on how to actually see the seriousness of their actions by taking the pen to paper and placing themselves as a surety. We're going to read the beginning. It's called The Development of Suretyship. The origins of the contractual relation of suretyship are one with the dawn of civilization. When the gregarious instincts of mankind first found expression in the crude social order of an early day, our distant progenitors were faced with communal as well as individual problems. The pattern of that embryonic society contained obligations of the individual to the community as well as of the individual to another. These obligations assumed or imposed, these promises expressed or implied, to do or to refrain from doing certain things were of such significance in the mind of early man that frequently some outside assurance was sought that the promiser would indeed fulfill the obligation. To trace here the changing forms of suretyship would scarcely be germane, and would but repeat the findings of other painstaking researchers. Suffice it is to say that almost every reference now extant to early suretyship sounds also a note of warning to those who might, however reluctantly, be willing to act as surety for a friend. Thus, from early Greece comes that sound of bit of philosophical advice found inscribed on a tablet in the Delphian temple and attributed to Thales, the Greek sage and philosopher, that suretyship is the precursor of ruin. Many similar warnings may be found in the Bible. Some 9 centuries before the Christian era, King Solomon, or his ghostwriter, for one must recall that an ancient monarch is reputed to have had 1,000 wives, and his literary efforts must have been subject to frequent interruption, warned the citizenry of Israel, "My son, if thou be surety for thy friend, if thou hast stricken thy hand with a stranger, thou art ensnared with the words of thy mouth, thou art taken with the words of thy mouth. Further, he that is surety for a stranger," the Hebrew word for another, "shall smart for it. And he that hateth suretyship is sure. Again, A man void of understanding striketh hands, and becometh surety in the presence of his friend. Then follows a most timely warning. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger. This is probably the earliest reference to the modern expression of losing one's shirt, if one assumes a certain risk. Ecclesiasticus paints an even blacker picture. Suretyship hath undone many of good estate, and shaken them as a wave of the sea. Mighty men hath it driven from their homes, so that they had to wander in strange lands. A doleful thought. In summation, there is the further warning, be not one of them that striketh hands, or of them that are sureties for debts. At this point, some digression might be permitted for the consideration of the phrase, strike hands. The evolution of the gesture is instructive. Primitive man, when approaching a stranger, extended the open hand as a gesture of friendliness, but primarily to indicate that no lethal weapon was held or concealed. This gesture of friendliness subsequently took the form of the striking of hands, which in turn became the hand clasp, or handshake, familiar to us today. This striking of hands not only demonstrated friendliness, but evidenced the sealing of a pact. Just as today we make a gentleman's agreement, one with another, and shake hands on it, so do our forefathers seal their obligations by the striking or shaking of hands. That then was the mode of execution of the early surety bond, which has today been supplanted by signatures of executing officers or attorneys in fact, attested by other officers of attorneys in fact, signed and sealed, and dressed up with powers of attorney, financial statements, certificates of authority, and in some jurisdictions, countersignatures, certificates of solvency, and the like. So much for progress. If you can understand the wealth of thought that was just narrated here, we've almost totally described our society today and what's going on. And because we don't understand this idea of suretyship, we wander blindly many times in financial transactions. And because the fact that we're in an aggregate society that works on an idea of commonwealth, though we seldom understand that maybe the party above us is really a master deceiver, who has given you a name to use that actually you're the only one that's going to back this up. But if someone behind the scenes who's playing a senior master in the role with the name, so we'll use the name John Smith, so to speak, as a reference. If John Smith is the master, but John Smith allows the servant to use the title John Smith, but John Smith has actually pledged something in trade on the use of that name, possibly in manners or methods of financial debt, and you end up being really the only effort of labor shown for this name John Smith. But at the same end, the debt is so high that John Smith is pledged behind the scenes as a senior master, controlling the name John Smith, the trade name. You could be in a world of doom in the future, maybe not even fully disclosed how much debt has been accumulated under the use of that trade name behind the scenes. And so therefore, as an aggregate, take all the social insurance registration names and numbers, put it into one big pool or one big insurance gamble system, and then people basically from the high to the low misusing the system to such an extent that it is irrecoverable, not payable back, and ready to explode in doom, and possibly sold to even worse taskmasters than what were originally involved in the structure of what was planned. And therefore, who is going to be the guy holding the hot potato at the end is probably more the question. But because you individually did not realize that the only inalienable thing that you had, or inalienable thing you had, or unalienable thing you ever had, was your given name or your Christian name, which is not transferable to any person, corporation, or trust, but you unwittingly or unknowingly got involved in a contractual obligation which requires your consent to take on the debt of another, almost as if you're playing the role of a surety at a level that could almost seem blasphemous in a way, because we know only Christ could be that surety. And therefore you taking on that role, not knowing, and seemingly innocently signing, thinking that it's nothing more than just regular business transactions going on in a day. But what you're really doing is showing the disease of society, which is that people who operate in a democratic society actually share sovereignty. And God never ever gave man sovereignty. God has always been sovereign, or basically in charge. And he doesn't need us to be miniature little gods down below. And in fact, we were only to respect him as the highest power creator, and therefore he would look after us as children. But removing ourselves from his care and protection, we have become the apparent authority for the child instead of being the child under the parent. And therefore, the debt is overwhelmingly gone to an extent now that the people that have purchased this debt may not be very friendly when they come to collect on it. And therefore, if you've looked at the economic news in its true sense, you would see that disaster is lurking at the edge of the door for the whole world. And my concern is that people take the time to actually do some research. We don't know if you're going to be able to find this book. This seems to be a rare book. I'll try to take a little bit more time out here and there on other videos to read more understandings of this. We're going to read actually another paragraph in here that is dealing with an understanding of the personal surety idea, because it has a subheading here called early personal surety, and we can gather what this really means after we slowly read this. Suretyship is perhaps the second oldest known profession. We know what the first oldest profession is. And it says the early surety was an individual. Sometimes he acted for a consideration, more frequently gratuitously as an accommodation to a friend. It is regrettable that experienced figures cannot be compiled in respect to the losses sustained by these early personal sureties. Were such information available, it would paint a cruel picture of disappointment and despair, of misplaced faith and subsequent insolvency, of the tremendous price paid for what at the outset seemed to be so innocuous a gesture of friendship. One can hardly imagine that these early sureties could or did avail themselves of even a small part of that fund of information which modern underwriters require before giving full consideration to a request for suretyship. Perhaps even then some bonds were peddled unsuccessfully and were viewed as dogs by available sureties, such as modern writers must spend a portion of their time considering and declining the dogs which they are asked to write every day. Even Job, that gentleman of many afflictions, had difficulty in finding a surety, for he asks dejectedly, "Who is he that will strike hands with me?" He obviously was unable to avail himself of the services of a resourceful and persuasive broker. We hope this is kind of bringing you into understanding that what they're really, and many times in these books, are talking in almost like a parable-like code. So you can play these videos back, because the likelihood of finding the book is not going to be very good out there. And I've to date only run across maybe 3 or 4 of these copies, and they seem to be not there now, at least as far as availability. So again, we'll read occasionally out of this if we're talking about something on a secular understanding of surety. Another little page in here just to show you how intensely well informed the writers of these books are on this subject. And for those who think they're actually going to outwit the system itself, they're setting themselves up for a fall, because they're chasing a carrot they'll never be able to reach. And therefore, we're going to read you the next little section that was dealing actually along the line of, could they possibly ever talk about how security documents or birth certificates or things like that would come about? Well, they did, and in fact they weren't hiding anything. And in fact these books were written to educate certain people in society that were going to be operating these instruments, so that they had an understanding of them. So I'm going to read you under assignment of case number, and this is dealing with bonds. It says, when a bond has been approved and executed and delivered, and the company thereby committed, The case is immediately referred by the underwriter to an assistant to have a comprehensive record of it made. This may be done by the assistants to the underwriters, or a special department may be maintained for this function. First, the case must be identified, and identification is initially provided by assigning it to an exclusive identifying number. The Home Office provides the branch office with a block of numbers running consecutively from the lowest to the highest. When the first number is used, it is charged to a particular case, and forever thereafter, that case bears that particular identifying number. To the next bond is assigned the next number in the block, and so on. This assigning of blocks of numbers not only sets up a system for the identification of individual cases, but it also enables the management to follow each case through every sector of the underwriting and accounting machinery, and permits no case to fall sparrow-like to the wayside. Preparation of label. This is what you should listen very closely to. When the newborn bond has thus been christened with a number, its birth certificate is prepared, its genealogical record entered, and the child adequately described for the archives of the company. This record appears upon a label or face sheet for the file, rather remotely similar to the daily reports used in casualty insurance, whereon appears a fair and comprehensible syllabus of the case itself. It must be in all pertinent points revealing, for it is the preview of the underwriting department, while automatic reprints of part of it are all that reach and guide the accounting and statistical departments. In prominent space across the top of the label is entered the number, the identification tag assigned to the bond. Just beneath appears the name of the underwriting department within whose jurisdiction the case lies, and to which the complete file or a copy of it, including the label, is forwarded for review. We hope that enlightens you on the idea that the system that you're in was not just winged or put into place by people who do not have an ability to understand how to organize, control, and to keep things in a certain orderly fashion for those that are requiring to run a life of participation down a control factor themselves. But they don't realize that someone has to be in charge somewhere, so even in their world, there is someone behind the scenes that's coordinating things that go on every day in your life while you are participating out there. And therefore, you could see how immensely deep the rabbit hole goes when you go down the world of all the things that occur in a given day, whether it be in the courts or whether you're driving that car down the road with insurance or any of the other things or aspects that are involved in all this. And I'm not here to promote the idea that this is a necessary good, but it appears for those that engage in evil, it may be a necessary evil because it would be anarchy without this system. And therefore, we hope that this has enlightened you briefly on this subject. And if you are fortunate enough to come across the book, it is called Corporate Suretyship. The author is Christ.